Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Centre for today's instalment in what really is now the closing stages in our 3-semester series on beauty, goodness and truth. We've only got 2 more sessions to go after this one, and then that'll be the whole thing over. With today's session, we turn our attention to a vital and perennial question, namely the relation of politics to truth. We'll be continuing that in our next session after Easter, when we think more exclusively about what many people fear is the endangered nature of truth in the current political era. But today we're thinking more generally and historically about this matter, and I really could not be more delighted with the panel we've assembled today to guide us through this topic. First of all, Dr. Patrick Drinan is Faculty Emeritus in USD's Department of Political Science and International Relations and Dean Emeritus in the College of Arts and Sciences. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia. And he came to USD in 1981, serving as Dean of the College from 1989 until 2006. Dr. Drinan is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Center for Academic Integrity. And in addition to his published work in political science and his many writings on cheating and academic integrity, he is also the author of The 12-Drop Rule, Getting the Most Out of Wine and Life. Dr. Michael Gonzalez is Professor of History here at USD, where he has taught since 1995. He was educated at Yale and at UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD. A specialist on Cold War and modern US history, Dr. Gonzalez has also written widely on the history of Spanish and Mexican California. His book, This Small City Will Be a Mexican Paradise, exploring the origins of Mexican culture in Los Angeles, 1821 to 1846, was published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2005. And finally, Dr. Tim McCarty received his PhD from Brandeis University and joined the faculty in the Department of Political Science and International Relations in 2015. Specializing in political theory, Professor McCarty is the co-editor of the Routledge book, Right-Wing Radicalism Today, Perspectives from Europe and the US, and he's currently at work on a book tentatively titled The Tragedy of Complicity. It's a great name for a book, I have to say. A study of the idea of complicity in democratic politics. So that's our panel. This really promises, I think, to be a fascinating session. So please give a very warm welcome to Professors Drinan, Gonzalez, and McCarty.
Thank you very much for that, Brian, and I really appreciated being invited back, but I'm up here kind of a lot. I was here Saturday night, and I'll be here in May for the end of the year party for the faculty, and I so enjoy this sacred spot on the planet. I'm talking about Machiavelli and the truth today, and we were trying to talk about the relationship of truth and politics. Well, you know, they may or may not get along. In fact, sometimes people think truth and politics are an oxymoron placed together. There are other oxymorons, as we know, things like military intelligence, happily married, things like that. Actually, military intelligence there are exceptions to it as an oxymoronic phrase because, there have been lots of good military intelligence over the years. For example, the German planning for the Battle of the Bulge in late 44, early 45. Things like the code talkers, the Navajo code talkers in World War II. In terms of happily married, my wife and I have been married for 51 years. So it is possible, I guess. And on politics and the truth, some people think it has no relationship, but it could. In fact, one of the most popular phrases we hear nowadays is speaking truth to power. How many of you heard that in the last month? Yeah, it's a very common phrase. But it suggests that power and the truth can be combined. But can they be? Machiavelli offers a precaution that is so compelling that he's often called the founder of modern political theory. Machiavelli, writing in the early 15th century during the Renaissance, firmly criticizes theocentric approaches and also idealism in the classical pursuit of the good. Machiavelli is a realist and an empiricist. His approach, quote, "For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation," unquote. The last part of that is so important. Let me repeat. He who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. It is not just that some of us are naive and pure of heart, but that idealism is dangerous when you do not have the power to achieve your goal. So dangerous indeed that it can lead to self-destruction. So, what is to be done, as Lenin would say in his tract in the 19th century, especially for political leaders? First, accept the fact that humans are cunning, dishonest creatures who are self-interested and self-regarding, and political entrepreneurs who are building states or institutions know this and must act on it. His theory is that this is the truth which leads to power. It is a modern idea, different from the classical political theorists. But is Machiavelli's theory true? After all, human beings are also known for their empathy and self-abnegating behavior. We have lots of empathy, really, in society. Self-abnegating behavior. People rush into buildings that are on fire to save kids and all sorts of things. Dive in front of shooters. Machiavelli does not deny that there is empathy and self-abnegating behavior, implying it is okay for the populist, but not for political entrepreneurs. For political entrepreneurs, those who are building states and institutions, it is better to be perceived as good than to be good. Still, human nature, even with the masses still are conniving, dishonest, and deceptive, and even at other times they are empathetic and self-abnegating. Jeremy Campbell, in The Liar's Tale, goes as far as to say that the only adults who speak honestly are autistic, and that is part of their disability, and I add their specialness. So, Machiavelli is, in effect, sublimating untruthfulness and turning it into a good for political entrepreneurs. But to what purpose? To build states as stable, orderly institutions. He is better, however, at describing political entrepreneurship than theorizing about the organization of the state itself. Machiavelli, then, is interested in power and the logic of power. Power seen as the ability to compel. Reading The Prince, there are many analyses of that logic. For a couple examples, don't share power, you'll lose it. See Donald J. Use violence quickly against opponents, but spread favors out over time, but avoid violence if possible because it is sloppy and unpredictable, amongst other disadvantages. In the Discourses, Machiavelli says to rely on the people against the aristocracy. Again, Donald J. So, some conclusions, and I have two of them. The legacy of Machiavelli is a constant in modern political theory and action-oriented politics, which is what I've always been interested in. I'm not into the esoteric necessarily. See, for example, in the 20th century, Saul Alinsky, the community organization activist who agrees with Machiavelli on the ends justifying the means. But Alinsky adapts it a bit. He says, quote, particular ends justify particular means. Or in the 20th century, one of the most famous political scientists in international relations, Hans Morgenthau, talked about national interest defined in terms of power. That is, you should not have an interest if you don't have the power to get from here to there. That would be wrong. Or see, one of my favorite authors, Samuel Huntington, who completes Machiavelli's work on building successful institutions in political order and changing societies. A beautifully crafted book that I quote in virtually every piece I ever do. And as a little surprise for our scientists in the room, there are a couple in here, another examples of people in the Machiavelli's tradition, Jared Diamond, a biologist who in Guns, Germs, and Steels explains political events by stipulating which factors, the absence of any one of which in the event phenomena could not occur. Okay? Basically that means you take a phenomena like how the Spanish defeated the two very superior civilizations of the Americas. How did that occur? It's a beautifully crafted book, won a Pulitzer Prize, goes through all the things that could have explained it. You could use probability analysis or other things. He says, don't do that. Take essentially 3 to 5 factors, the absence of any one of which, and that event could not have occurred. I use that all the time when I was deaning, when I was teaching, and I use it, and my wife and I do a lot of pro bono political consulting in North County on down ballot races. And we've been pretty successful, even though it's not a region that is conducive to our political ideology. So it's a very, very powerful way of doing it. And in a sense, it's a variation of the end justifies the means, because you've got to say to yourself, these means get to a particular end. The Science Center, as some of you know, was built almost 20 years ago, and I was involved in the planning of that over a decade with the faculty and the administration, and I used that explicitly in terms of trying to set up the factors that got that beautiful facility built. So the second conclusion is, when you hear someone say there is a need to speak truth to power, think that Machiavelli was one of the first moderns to say that. But what he meant was speaking to political entrepreneurs. Speaking truth to power has several meanings. Think about Machiavelli as you're thinking about some of those meanings. Thank you very much.
If I stand here, can you still hear me? I don't like to be held captive by the podium. Well, first of all, remind you, my name is Michael Gonzalez. I teach in the history department, and I'm always pleased to see friends and colleagues and students at this event. It's always a pleasure to stand before any aspect of the student community and faculty community at USD, so I'm pleased to be here, and I thank Brian again for hosting these wonderful events. It's really uplifting and raises the profile of the university. In that spirit of uplift, I'm going to talk about truth and lies in American history within maybe 20 minutes, so we're going to take an intellectual route march through history. But before I do that, I want to talk about scenes that could be ripped from today's headlines. I want all of us to imagine an immigrant horde waiting at the border, waiting to sweep into the country and swamping our cities. Or you can also imagine a deep state in the federal government, where we have these entities working at cross purposes. They work for their own benefit and thwart the will of the people and thwart the will of the president. Or you can also talk about maybe a foreign power conspiring, working closely with spies within the United States to exert their will. But I can take a step back. I'm not necessarily talking about now. I could be talking about perhaps Irish immigrants in the 1840s, or Chinese immigrants in the 1870s up through the 1880s. And hopefully I didn't lose a battery. I'll show you here. Let's see. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon from 1871. Thomas Nast, who curiously was a German immigrant himself, and for Harper's Weekly, he penned this political cartoon, and it's called The American River Ganges, and the caption is "The Priest and the Children." And you show these valiant American youth. This young man has got the Holy Bible stuck into his vest or his jacket. And if you look closely, they look like crocodiles, but if you look really closely, they're actually Catholic bishops. And the bishop's mitre is a snapping jaws of an alligator. And Thomas Nast was very big on racial stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes. If you look closely at their facial features, small nose, big jaw, we're talking about Irish immigrants. And lest we lose and miss the point, in the background we've got the Vatican, the papal crest hanging, flying from one dome, and the Irish harp flying from the other. And then we go to the next image. This is a caricature of a Chinese immigrant. And you can see this is 1899, and it reads The Yellow Peril from the American publication Puck. And you have a poor, defenseless white woman who's obviously been ravaged. And then the Chinese gentleman is going off to do his dirty work. So we talk about this immigrant horde. This is an ancient, at least by American standards, is an ancient image in American history. These immigrants are always plotting to do evil and seeking to spread their criminality within American cities. And as far as, say, for example, the deep state, I'm sure many of us are conversant in the current political situation, and I'll try to keep my references to President Trump to a minimum for today's presentation, but I'll have to resist the temptation in this instance. The president oftentimes talks about a deep state, where there are entities within his administration working against his best interests. But this is an old claim in American history. If you go back to the 19th century, you have the slave power, where the Supreme Court, the State Department, was flooded with politicians seeking to promote slave interests. And conversely, in the American South, you have the abolitionist power, where Congress was infected with the abolitionist virus to prevent the spread of slavery. And I can go one step further. In the 19th century, there are fears that the Jesuits, the Masons, the Illuminati, working together, working individually, sometimes working with the slave power or the abolitionist power, working together to somehow undermine the integrity of the United States. This, again, is an old fear in American politics. And the third idea about a foreign power seeking to corrupt the United States, this too is a familiar fear in American historiography. We can go back to the latter part of the 18th century, where the fear was that the French revolutionaries were sending spies over to the United States. This is during the height of the French Revolution. And these French spies were doing everything in their power, not only to corrupt the American Congress, corrupt the American newspapers, but seeking to spread revolution throughout American cities. So again, and we can even go through the early part of the 20th century, where there is evidence that, I shouldn't say evidence, the fear was that the Germans during World War I Germans were working with the Mexican government to somehow fight refight the Mexican-American War and retake the territory that was lost in 1848. And of course, talking about a foreign power, the Russian impact or the Soviet impact in American politics is an old theme as far back as the 1950s. For all you undergraduates, when you go home, if you want to really mull over what we're saying, go to Google and key in the words active measures. Active measures is a Soviet espionage term where, again, in the 50s, the KGB would use false correspondence to newspapers, plant articles in newspapers, and then as editorials in newspapers, even write letters to the editor to foment and encourage racial and social divide in the United States. And of course, the recent election in 2016 is yet one more example of active measures, this time not on the part of the Soviets, but of course, their successors, the Russian government. So, but we're talking about truth and lies today. And all these stories I've said, there is indeed a kernel of truth. Criminals do happen to be immigrants sometimes, but if we look at the statistics, the criminality amongst immigrants, whether it be the 19th century, 20th, or 21st century, is very, very low. Native-born Americans are more likely to commit crimes. But whenever an immigrant does commit a crime, it's exaggerated to hysterical proportions. And there is evidence, of course, that the French did send over spies to the United States in the 18th century. But that, too, has been exaggerated. There's at least, at least 2 instances of a spy being discovered working in the United States. Hardly the big mob of spies establishing a network along the eastern seaboard, or what at that point constituted the American West, in areas like Ohio down through Louisiana. And there is also evidence, of course, that the Germans did contact the Mexican government during World War I, but never to the point where they both worked together to hatch a plan to take back the American Southwest. So there indeed is a kernel of truth in all these things I've talked about, but why are they distorted? Why they're exaggerated to such extremes? Richard Hofstadter, we'll go here. In 1963, Richard Hofstadter, an American historian at Columbia University, unfortunately he died at a very young age. He was 50 years old. He died in 1970. And 7 years before his death, he wrote this book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And he explored this problem. He's writing on the heels of the McCarty terror and McCarthy fear, the 1950s. And he thought this is the wrong question to ask about truth and lies. And I'd say, maybe like myself as an academic, when I talk to my students, some of whom I see here, and I might be likely to say, well, so-and-so is not telling the truth, or so-and-so might be spreading a lie. Richard Hofstadter warned, maybe historians or scholars shouldn't do that. Maybe the better question to ask is, why do people believe outlandish tales in the first place? Why is a lie, a falsehood, embraced more readily than the truth? Obviously, lies, falsehoods are more exaggerated, they're more sensational. Hence, it's more likely that they'll be embraced. But Hofstadter went one step further. He said there's something about a lie, a falsehood, that has some sort of emotional appeal, that has some sort of purchase on the soul. Now, why is that, he said? And one of the unique things about the United States, it should be no surprise, we live in a democracy. We have in most instances, we have a very free, active, and vigorous free press. And if there's anything in a society, in a culture that prizes transparency, why is it so easy for lies and falsehoods to take root? So this is what Richard Hofstadter argued in his great book. He said that we Americans are victimized by our own sense of history. We have fallen prey to the way we look at the past. And since we're seduced by the way we look at the past, by our own imagination, therefore, we have fallen prey to this way we imagine our past, and our past is now victimizing us in the present. In this case, the 1960s, and maybe now in the 21st century. And he rested his argument on 3 points. The first point, Americans like to see themselves as being resourceful, individualistic. And these Americans are confronting a hostile wilderness, hostile elements in nature. And this resourceful individual has to test himself, and always a man. Hofstadter is very clear about that. It's always a man. This individual, therefore, has to exert his will against nature in order to establish himself. So our view of history is always individualistic, 1. 2, we see nature as a hostile place that has to be subdued, and only the individual's resourcefulness can subdue nature. And then thirdly, the third element is this individual, to be resourceful, to confront nature, has to exert force. And that means this individual needs a firearm, needs a weapon to accomplish his task. He goes even further. Hofstadter therefore adds to his belief, his argument, that this leads to the way Americans look at the mind, the way we use our intellect. He maintained that we Americans, now this is a subtle distinction, and I think the undergraduates will listen to me, you're welcome to do whatever you want, but I invite you to listen to what I say here. It says we Americans believe that the intellect is to do something, okay? The intellect is not for thinking, it's for doing. If you do something, that means you're productive. You create something. If you just use your intellect to think, you don't produce anything. You don't accomplish anything. So therefore, Hofstadter argued, since we use our intellect to do something, there becomes this contempt for the life of the mind. Because if we're doing something, that means I rely on my wits, my expertise. I don't need an expert who sits in the ivory tower, maybe like this one, to tell me what I should do, to tell me how I should conduct my life. I can rely on my own senses of how I should find success. And I will only listen to people who think like I do, rely on their wits, rely on their instincts, rely on their guts to find success. Now, I'll make one reference to the president. I'm sure many of us remember, maybe some of you don't want to remember, but during the 2016 election, the president made it a big point that he didn't use focus groups or polls. He didn't read briefing books. He said, this is the way I read the news, he said he relied on his guts. He relied on instinct to know what he needed to do to secure victory. And in fairness, George W. Bush also was famous, or maybe infamous, depending on your political disposition. He was also famous for not reading his briefing books. And Ronald Reagan, who is now, for me, mysteriously, is now celebrated. Ronald Reagan also was averse to reading briefing books. So this is not necessarily the president, the current incumbent in the White House, but this is a theme in the last part of last part of the 20th, early part of the 21st century. There seems to be many of our political leaders have had this, now I don't want to use the word contempt, but have had this dislike for received wisdom and for our expertise. Now, the way, and to illustrate in front of, before I close, so I hand off to Tim, I'm going to go one more point here. Oops, that's how I wanted to close. I made a mistake. This is where, so I gave away the game there. But anyway, this is I show this to all my classes. I don't know if Joanna remembers this, or Reem, but this is what Hofstadter is talking about. And one of the history lessons I try to teach my students, like my colleagues, what we think happens is more important than what actually happens. And Hofstadter is discussing basically, we Americans like to imagine ourselves as these brave, stalwart people marching into the wilderness. And this painting, among many paintings I could have chosen, I just chose this one. It's a great piece of art. It's by George Caleb Bingham. He did it between 1851 and 1852, and the title of the painting is Daniel Boone Escorting Settlers to the Cumberland Gap. And this painting testifies to some of the things I'm talking about. Here you've got Daniel Boone with his firearm, of course, leading his wife. And if you, we don't have time to go into the religious imagery here, but you can imagine here Joseph leading Mary back to the promised land. Here the way she has the shawl wrapped over her head and her shoulders, on a white horse, no less. And of course, all these other gentlemen have weapons as well. They're ready for action. And if you look at the background here, it's a blasted landscape. These trees have been splintered either by a storm, by some sort of natural disaster. This tree been shattered, this one as well. But then this is in darkness, and the light is shining on Daniel Boone. So this gets back to what I'm trying to say about, what Hofstadter is trying to say. Since we have this myth this fantasy. And this is, of course, historically speaking, of course, the real history is sometimes not exciting as the myth. But really, in historical terms, the federal government always worked very closely with Western settlement, where they're using federal troops to clear out Indians, granting land to railroad companies, protecting miners who went off in, say, the Black Hills and what is now South Dakota. The federal government always had a very active role in supporting individuals in their march across the wilderness. Hardly the individuals by themselves with their firearms were not necessarily the people who conquered the American continent, but that's how Americans like to see themselves. And this painting testifies to that. And finally, to close off here, oops, go back this way. And this is, I wanted to show this. This is Donald Trump, and this is the President Trump. No man, no woman, no commie can stump him. And this is everything that I believe this is around 2017. This basically, in some people's imagination perhaps, this is who the president embodies. The tough male, and with his firearm, and he's obviously ready for action. And I think the one thing I should emphasize here, I've not said it enough, when Hofstadter talked about the man being the embodiment of the American spirit, because it's the man who uses his guts, his instincts, his wits to survive. Intellectuals, professors perhaps, are effeminate, because since all they do is think, they don't do anything. They can't be men, they've got to be something else. They could be women, or if not women, they're close to women, they're effeminate here. So, to close, Hofstadter proposed we shouldn't ask why there's no truth. We shouldn't even ask why there are lies. Maybe the better question to ask, why these stories believe in the first place, and why these stories have purchase, why they have influence, may be rooted in the way we look at history. So thank you very much. All right.
Of course, these are the acts I have to follow. I feel like I am called to mind the old Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the others. So hopefully you will bear with me. Thank you for allowing me to share this space with all of you. So when Brian asked me to give this talk, he suggested that I read Hannah Arendt's two great essays on politics and lies. The first one from 1967 called Truth in Politics. The second one from 1971 called Lying in Politics. And so my remarks today are reflections occasioned by my own deeply inexpert reading of these essays, and I'm not so much summarizing or trying to offer my own certain and authentic conceptions of lying in politics, but trying to sort of inhabit Arendt's vision and see if by working through it we can determine if there's wisdom there. So in order to get started to give a talk about Hannah Arendt, I'm going to talk about a play most of you haven't read. This is Bertolt Brecht's Life of Galileo. Some of you may have read this in AP World History or something like that, but it revolves around the scientist Galileo's fateful encounters with the Inquisition. And the playwright in that play gives his scientist a prop that signifies Galileo's reliance on the ineradicability of scientific truth to keep himself grounded. And the prop is a pebble that he keeps in his pocket. And I didn't have a pebble, but I took a mint from Dr. Dixon's jar of mints. And what Galileo does in the play is whenever he's feeling uncertain or unmoored, what he does is he drops the pebble from one hand to the other to remind himself of the fact of gravity. It keeps him grounded, right? So as he's feeling uncertain. And at least at the beginning of the play, Galileo is supremely confident that for all of the complaints made by the monks and nobles about his troubling findings, the power of objective and factual truth will win out in the end. And prior to his first encounter with the Inquisition, he expresses certainty that no matter their inclinations, the monks are going to submit to the proof before their eyes. He says this to one of his friends: "Yes, I believe in reason's gentle tyranny over people. Sooner or later, they have to give in to it. Nobody can go on indefinitely watching me drop a pebble and then say it doesn't fall. No human being is capable of that. The lure of proof is too great. Now, of course, we all know what happened to Galileo when he encountered the Inquisition. And the story Brecht tells in The Life of Galileo is the story of a scientist who tragically fails to anticipate exactly how capable human beings are of watching him drop that pebble, and either, at best, looking away, or at worst, watching it fall and claiming that it rises to the ceiling. And this is a long way of saying that those who love truth for its own sake, and those who set out to be truth tellers in public life, often find themselves similarly ill-prepared to deal with the power and depth of political mendacity. Any of us who love truth, as I imagine you do because you're here, and would like to see it prevail in politics, would do well to heed the lessons of Brecht's Galileo and his failure to fully anticipate the power of lies and the persistence of political resistance to even the most obvious truths. This is where our rent comes in, I promise. All right, so despite all of our cliches about lying in politics, and Professor Drinan lifted this up sort of wonderfully, our expectations that lies are everywhere, our jokes, our cynical remarks, I think that at bottom, most of us tend to assume, at least implicitly, that truthfulness, honesty, integrity, and the like are the norm in democratic political life. That's really what we believe, and we see the liar as an aberration on our politics. Something has gone wrong when the liar emerges. As much as we say we expect it, we don't. We never expect it. The realm of democratic politics is assumed to be a realm of honest brokerage, all else being equal. And the liar is an aberration, a troublemaker, an upsetter of decent norms of forthright communication. Despite our jokes about lying politicians, it's a federal crime to lie to Congress. We have recently impeached a president for lying for committing perjury. And yet, what Arendt tells us, what she argues in her two essays, is that the true nature of politics is such that she says, quote, truthfulness has never been counted among the political virtues. She says, when we talk about lying, let us remember that the lie did not creep into politics by some accident of human sinfulness. Moral outrage, for this reason alone, is not likely to make it disappear. Arendt tells us something peculiar, which is that it is not the liar who is the unwelcome intruder into the realm of politics, but rather the truth teller. Lying is a creative act. Lying requires imagination. Lying is a source of power. Lying is freedom. Lying is politics in this sense. And the reason for this is that the realm of the political is the realm of opinion. Arendt distinguishes between what she calls rational truth, factual truth, and opinion. Now, rational truth, these are things like the mathematical or philosophical truths that transcend human experience. So that pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to a diameter, the validity of modus ponens, something like that the pH of water is 7, which I learned 2 weeks ago. On the other hand, factual truth, those are things that have happened in the world, in human events. So that Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, that the Beatles played Ed Sullivan, that Nietzsche went crazy hugging a horse, that I had yogurt for breakfast. These are all the things that are factual truths. And Arendt is concerned that when rational or factual truths are drawn into the realm of politics, the realm of opinion, they are imperiled. Because opinion refers to understandings of the world as filtered through human perception. And the true value of opinion is largely contingent on its correlation with rational and factual truths. And so she thinks that both of them are fragile in the realm of opinion. What she's concerned about is that the realm of opinion is the liar's playground. The liar has power in the realm of opinion. The liar can shift opinion by distorting the truth that shapes opinion. The liar can cast these truths, which are properly the framework of opinion, as themselves merely opinions. So if the liar is able to convince you that the world is flat, then the liar has accomplished something in the realm of opinion. Furthermore, if the liar is able to convince you to merely take it as, well, it's my opinion that the world is flat and your opinion that the world is round, the liar is capable of moving us, is capable of moving our engagement with the world. And this is because politics, according to Arendt, is about action taken to change the world, collective action taken to change the world. And when we seek to change the world, we are always implicitly rejecting what is for what is not. We can't change the world unless we in some way reject reality. We are saying, this is what is, I reject this, I endorse what is not yet. The liar, on the other hand, merely says, yeah, what is not. The difference is that politics, again, is supposed to be rejecting what is in favor of what can be, whereas the liar is about rejecting what is in favor of what cannot be. By the time we figure that out, he's already skipped town. This is the concern. And the trouble is that to proclaim what is not is thrilling and liberating and exciting and delightful. This is what the liar does. The liar opens up all the possibilities of the world. This is why lying is freedom. The realm of freedom, the realm of democratic politics, is the realm of imagining what may be done. But of course, what truth is all about is telling us what we can't do. It's telling us what is not to be done. So the role that truth plays in the realm of politics is actually just to set the limits on the possible. It has been said that politics is the art of the possible, and truth sets the horizons of the possible. But it's within that space, the space of opinion, that the liar can get his hooks in us. And so truth, again, by its very nature, is what is immovable, unchangeable, that which will put limits on what can be done. But of course, the political visionary, the dreamer, the optimist, the doer, is the person who says, well, but what can we do? Maybe we can do things that the wet blanket truth teller is telling us we can't do. And so the liar is like the dreamer, the visionary, the prophet who liberates us from the dull shackles of reality. And the truth teller is the person putting the dull shackles of reality back on us, which is why we don't like them. Lying is endemic to politics because lying is freedom. Truth-telling is boring. Truth-telling is unexciting. The liar tells you you can fly. The truth-teller tells you you cannot. Now, obviously, you appreciate the truth-teller when you don't fall to your death, but it's no fun when they don't let you even try. And the peculiar thing that Arendt says about this is that unlike lying, which is liberating, which is freeing, truth-telling, or the truth itself, is coercive. And this gets back to what Brecht's Galileo says about the gentle tyranny of truth. She says, this is in Truth and Politics, seen from the viewpoint of politics, truth has a despotic character. Unwelcome opinion can be argued with, rejected, compromised upon, but unwelcome facts possess an infuriating stubbornness that nothing can move except plain lies. The trouble is that factual truth, like all other truth, claims to be acknowledged and precludes debate, and debate constitutes the very essence of political life. So this is the problem with truth-telling in politics. The problem with truth-telling in politics is that the liar seeks to be master of reality itself. The truth-teller seeks to merely make us submit to the truth such as it is. And that we experience that being told to submit as coercive, as tamping down our desires, our freedom, our possibilities for liberation. This is why the liar is the more natural political actor than the truth-teller. And there's a second reason for this. The second reason the liar is the more natural political actor than the truth-teller is because truth, and especially factual truth, has to be contextualized to be considered politically significant. You have to tell a story about a fact to make it politically significant. Truth only has political significance if it speaks to questions of things like interest and ideology. A fact such that my shirt is green only matters for politics if it occurs to someone that it is in their interest for my shirt to be recognized as blue. and then this fact becomes subject to opinion, subject to political jockeying. The truth teller has this problem because when she enters into the political realm, she must compromise her temperamental instinct to merely express the truth and have it recognized as the truth for its own sake. She doesn't want to have to explain why someone should accept a fact as a fact. Its status as a fact ought to be enough. But of course, that's not the language of democratic politics, that's the language of compulsion. And the language of compulsion doesn't sit well with democratic politics. Truth, in other words, if it's to enter into politics, must be fit into rhetoric. In politics, a fact cannot simply be true, it must also be persuasive. And once we are persuading you to accept a fact as true, we are out of the realm of truth-telling per se and into the realm of rhetoric and politics. And the truth-teller has to be prepared to answer the profoundly strange question of, why do you want me to believe this particular fact? How is it in your interest that I or we accept this fact as true? And to answer that truth should be believed because it is true, again, is to speak of reason's gentle tyranny. To even participate in giving reasons to accept facts outside of their demonstrated factuality is to undermine the imperative of truth itself. It's to play the liar's game. And the liar faces none of these difficulties because the liar is more naturally suited to politics. In lying and being believed, the liar has accomplished something. They've achieved something in the world. They've created something new. They have changed the world. They have exercised their will and power over other people. The truth teller, on the other hand, is merely the almost passive instrument by which facts are delivered. That I get you to believe a fact as true is not a credit to me, it's a credit to the fact. That I get you to believe a lie as true, that's all about me. I did a good job there. And so, what's problem is that the truth teller is largely incidental to the process of truth telling and is perfectly replaceable with any other person willing to do the work of relaying the message. Not only that, but we have known, at least since Plato, that the lover of truth will always be a little bit out of their element in politics, especially democratic politics. The only place where the lover of truth can comfortably practice politics is in the kind of philosophical utopia that Plato didn't even allow himself to fully imagine was possible. Because, of course, in any other place, the truth teller has to succumb to the level of the many and speak in the language of the marketplace and persuade the many to accept the truths as true. Those who love the truth for itself will always find it grating to have to persuade their fellow citizens not to love the truth for itself as they do. That's an impossible ask. We will never persuade the many to love the truth for itself. But merely that accepting the truth is in their interest, is suitable to their sensibilities, compatible with their prejudices, without interrogating these sensibilities, these prejudices, these interests. And if lovers of truth are committed to democracy, as I suspect many of us in this room are, then they must enter into the realm of politics with the recognition that they may fail to persuade their fellow citizens. And in failing to persuade their fellow citizens, they are duty-bound to allow the truth to lose out to whatever untruth is more suited to the interests, prejudices, and sensibilities of the many. In other words, merely entering into democratic politics is to admit that truth is subservient to interest. And if you are a lover of truth, that's the worst. Of course, if all else is equal, everyone would choose the truth over a lie. But of course, we know in politics, all else is never equal. And now, of course, you might say, well, okay, so what? So, all right, let's just lie a bunch. Politics is for lying, academia is for truth-telling, and let's let them be. Well, the problem is, and Arendt lays out all kinds of problems for this. And the first problem is that the freedom offered by lying is a false freedom. It's an empty freedom, right? You feel free. When I tell you can fly, that's super exciting. But when you try to fly and break your leg, it's a drag. And the power that comes from lying is just what Arendt says is violence and domination. Arendt says true power is never violence. Violence, the forcing of people to accept your will, is not power at all, but is in fact rank coercion that one engages in when one lacks power. And I can talk more about this later, but it's neither here nor there. But the most serious problem that comes from the proliferation of lying, in other words, if the truth tellers just let politics go and don't engage in politics, is that not that lies will be accepted as truth. What Arendt says, and she says this over and over and over again in work after work after work, is that the danger is not that lies will be accepted as truth, but that the mass will become indifferent to the distinction between lies and truth. And if not indifferent, then incapable of orienting themselves on the distinction between lies and truth. She says in an interview from 1974, if everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can do what you please. The collective capacity to act, according to Arendt, is the definition of politics. Politics is acting on our collective capacity, which we cannot do if we are not capable of exercising our collective judgment to act in the world. When lying as a way of life proliferates, such that public life becomes untethered from reality, things like ideology come in to do that work. Poisonous ideology like fascism, like Bolshevism. When reality is no longer the thing by which we orient ourselves, ideology will do. When reality is no longer the thing that makes it possible for us to communicate coherently with each other, ideology will do. This is the danger that Arendt saw. And so, once again, what is to be done? And the answer of what is to be done is, I think, given the profound dangers of a political world untethered from reality, there's a responsibility among the lovers of truth to engage in politics, no matter how fruitless and no matter how irritating it may be. There are basically three options, I think, for the lovers of truth in politics. And option number one is we could say persist in the hopeless naivete of Brecht's Galileo. We could patiently await the day when our fellow citizens will emerge from the shadows of their own accord and come to recognize the imperative of truth for truth's sake, compelled only by the voice of reason within to submit to undeniable proof. Such a life is, alas, probably only possible for those lucky enough to live in an age in which liars and charlatans have given up. The Office of Inquisition has closed up shop, put away the implements of torture, and redirected all the resources to the National Institutes of Science. I don't know about you, but I'm not convinced we live in one of those ages. Our second option is to become obstinate crusaders for the truth. To reference another play that you haven't read, in Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, his protagonist, Dr. Stockman, becomes exactly that kind of obstinate crusader for the truth, demanding that his fellow citizens recognize proof as simply its own imperative. And he proceeds to not only destroy his own life, but the life of his family and community around him in the process. We become not just trusting in reason's gentle tyranny, but the agents rendering that tyranny of reason less and less gentle until we find ourselves being the sort of thing that we despise. And so we're left with option three. Option three, which we could call something like a politics of responsibility. And a politics of responsibility is one in which those who love the truth descend back into the cave of ignorance, not to pull the citizens out into the light, but instead to gently and humbly seek to persuade them that the truths on offer are suited to the lives they seek to lead and are more suited to those lives than the lies that have entranced them. Again, what should inspire this responsibility is not hope that truth itself will always prevail, that reason will win out, that democracy will become wise, and that facts will become the dominant currency of our politics. Rather, it's the certainty that the liars are ineradicable, and that when opposing lies with truth in politics, we're always fighting on their turf. The lovers of truth must compromise their desire to speak only the language of reason and become conversant in the language of politics, which is to say rhetoric rather than philosophy, common sense rather than science, as much as it is distressing to us who love the truth. We have to recognize that the victories won on the side of truth-tellers are not triumphs of truth itself, which is never the dominant currency of politics, but rather successful accommodation of facts to the demands of the political and interests to the bounds of the factual. And of course, the truth-tellers must realize that all victories as such remain precarious. Facts may win the day. We may retreat into our studies, consoling ourselves in the company of fellow lovers of truth, but the mendacious nature of the political is permanent. It is a permanent problem of the human condition, and we will inevitably find truth imperiled anew by the inexhaustible army of liars fixing to lay siege on our polity. And so, what Arendt is trying to tell the lovers of truth is that the rewards of political engagement, and by the way, I'm not talking about them, but she does think there are rewards to political engagement. There's joy, there's community, there's creation, there's creativity. But the rewards of political engagement are not to be mistaken for the rewards of science or philosophy. Politics will never be a realm in which truth itself is a cause for joy. What is a cause for joy is our ability to accomplish things together within the political realm, which remains the realm of opinion. But hopefully, what we can accomplish will be within the bounds of rational and factual truth, such that freedom and collective action are truly possible. What we must remember, according to Arendt, is that the liar is always most at home in politics. And for the truth teller, politics is a nice place to visit, but it's no place to live.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. It seems to me like one of the things is about misdirection. And I got this idea sort of like just last week I listened to somebody talk about Alfred Hitchcock and Rear Window. And although I love Alfred Hitchcock as a filmmaker, I had a deep criticism of the movie and expressed it to the guy. And I told him, like, the problem with Alfred Hitchcock quite often is there are internal struggles about the nature of truth, the nature of evil, and so forth, that it should be examined internally, but he externalized it into exterior. And Rear Window is a great example, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that he was a voyeur. The movie could have examined the sin within and how he's going to struggle with that, but in fact, it misdirected us to a thriller. And by doing so, he uncovered a murder scene, and therefore he absolved himself of his own sins by uncovering another sin. It seems to me politics quite often has something to do with misdirection. Therefore, externalizing what we should examine within ourselves, rather than we're always so easy to find a sin somewhere else so that we absolve ourselves. Could any of you address that issue? Because some of you come close to expressing it.
Well, I think it's an interesting observation, and in response, which I think is close to what you're trying to get to, is my favorite Trump joke, which you can tell to Trump supporters or Trump opponents. And that is, what's the difference between God and Donald Trump? And the answer is, God knows he's not Donald Trump. There's a lot of misdirection, in movies and in politics and the like. And I think one of the things that comes out of our presentations is that time is a factor. There's lags. I think Machiavelli, for sure, he's seeing lots of social change, and they're trying to build some order out of all these things going around and around. And the difficulty is that social change occurs much more rapidly than political development. And so there's almost always a lag between the social change and you're catching up with it. And the catching up thing, you're always catching up. And sometimes it's a two-generation process, that catching up process. And so there's all sorts of things happening. Now, if there's no social change, you don't have that kind of phenomena. But of course, in the modern world, we have it in spades.
Well, my reading of the movie is different, but it may address what you're saying. I always thought that was the archetypal Cold War movie. Suspicion, the Jimmy Stewart character suspects his neighbor of being a murderer, and it turns out to be the case that the Raymond Burr character is indeed a murderer. But I here, the suspicion alone was enough to convict the Raymond Burr character, at least in the mind of Jimmy Stewart. So I thought it was a perfect Cold War movie where suspicion is enough to confirm the guilt of somebody else. And maybe that gets to what you're saying, which is a great point about you absolve yourself of this guilt, that you're violating someone's privacy by looking into someone's rear window. But I see it as more fundamental, is that suspicion alone is grounds enough to impugn someone's integrity. And that's the only way I can respond to your very insightful question.
Thank you guys for the talks. They were really informative and really entertaining. I don't know who I'd want to ask the question to, but I'm thinking mostly of Hofstede's conclusion regarding the kind of anti-intellectualism and the fact that if a person's going to be in a kind of political position, one of the things that they're going to need is weapons. It kind of sends me back in some way to Tim's point about the fact that the lover of truth is actually always going to be a bit on the outside of the political in this way. But then all of that takes me back to chapter 6 of Machiavelli's The Prince, where he draws the famous distinction between armed prophets and unarmed prophets. Right? He just kind of says, look, it's always better to be an armed prophet if it's the case that you would like your principality to actually like take hold of your vision. But there are really interesting counterexamples to that particular claim. I mean, history may give us evidence that armed prophets tend to win more than others, and yet the longevity of certain unarmed prophets is equally empirically undeniable. And I'm kind of wondering what you'll think about something like that as a maybe more naive or optimistic way of kind of taking this truth issue.
Only thing I can say is I've read some really interesting essays about the archetypal American hero, which I don't know if it really speaks to what you're asking, but the American, whether it be superhero movies, literature, the archetypal American hero in film and literature, he's always a loner. He's always armed. He has no attachments to family or even to the society he represents. He serves as this human entry point between the wilderness and civilization. And you need the hero who's armed. He's not burdened by family obligations, not even burdened by religion. He acts for himself. He lives for violence. And his very act of doing that clears the way for the advancement of civilization. And civilization doesn't need him, so he can't live in civilization, so he continues moving westward. If you look at the Batman movies, Batman is this guy who lives on the Mars. I mean, of course, he's fantastically rich, has all these gadgets at his disposal, but he clears the way for Gotham City to prosper. Or John Wayne in the movie The Searchers. I mean, that's always seen as a great scene. The concluding scene where John Wayne stands in the doorway after he frees a Natalie Wood character. John Wayne doesn't enter the house to where Natalie Wood is reuniting with her family. He stands at the doorway and he turns around and he walks away. So I don't know how this fits with the idea about armed prophets and unarmed prophets, but I think in the American context, we celebrate these loners, these heroes, and of course, look at fatally speaking, how many times have we as a nation been victimized by the loner with a gun? We celebrate them in film, in the literature, but in real life, the loner with a gun has wrought all sorts of havoc on our society. So that's the only thing. That's the only way I can respond to what you're saying. I'm sorry.
No, Rambo.
Yeah, Rambo. Yeah, exactly. Rambo's another type of character that way.
We have a woman back there. We need to get a woman's voice here.
So my question is about the idea that
the liar is endemic to politics. Because I was just thinking when we were talking about these myths that we have in American culture, there's a myth that we're taught very young about to revere, especially in politics, the almost superhuman truth teller. Honest Abe, George Washington saying, "I cannot tell a lie." So this is kind of like the ideal that we're looking for in politics, and yet you're saying, and which should be obvious to anyone who watches the news, that the liar is endemic to politics. So how do American people balance these two things in their mind?
I mean, I think the answer goes back to Machiavelli in a sense, right? That like the least, the number one characteristic of a successful Machiavellian is that you don't know to call him a Machiavellian, right? That like you, and this is the sort of the paradox of the sort of space of lies in politics, is that the liar is a natural political actor, but at some level you can't know they are a liar as such, right? They are successful if they are not perceived as a liar, or at least not for long, because it's when those lies are understood to be lies, they don't have the persuasive power, the liberating power, because they're known to be sort of empty. But if those lies can be either just simply believed, or they can be conceptualized as being visionary, or being dreams or sort of ideals, then the liar can sort of persist. But that's what Arendt says, is that the only, this is in Origins of Totalitarianism, she talks about, that is, totalitarianism is lying in politics taken up to the way of life, such that when ideology fully replaces reality as the grounding basis for politics, then you can lie with abandon, right? You can say, Russia is the homeland of elephants, and it's fine because we just affirm whatever is said, because we know that what we're really doing is following the ideology. So it's a delicate balancing, ultimately.
So there's at some point where the ideology takes the place of truth.
Yes.
Way back.
It's 2019, where we are now. Concerned about what cyberspace is doing to the question of truth and lies, and how campaigning is taking place in a digital atmosphere where people are being targeted in terms of developing political ideas, developing opinions. Can someone comment on what this means, algorithms, and how people are being influenced in a digital context today? It may be different from what we had campaigning prior to the introduction of the internet in politics.
I'll reveal my age. When I was in high school, I can remember Huntley and Brinkley, NBC News. The news was national news was 15 minutes a day. They debated off and on for 8 or 9 months whether they could go to a half an hour. Was there enough news to fill it? And now, of course, we have 24-hour news channels all over the place. Well, it gets back to, my only comment is, it's just chaos. The social change is so rapid, that's almost impossible ever to catch up. And you can't build too many walls to stop it from occurring, because people just get around it. It's like rule making and regulations. People find out ways to get around the blockages. And so, I'm not terribly optimistic about it. The only thing that I'm optimistic about is that when it gets down to it, even with all this news and social media and the like, really it's only about 20% of the people who are the attentive public that pay attention on a sustained basis to the truth and the lies that are out there. And most of the people, most of the time, they don't know who the Vice President of the United States is, So I'm not sure how much it corrupts politics. All I know is it's dangerous, but it's a dangerous world.
How the truth might be bent in terms of influencing people. You have agents going into people's private affairs and essentially campaigning individually. How does that work? You have algorithms. How is that working to determine people's political mindset?
Well, as the token, I am in fact a millennial. by I believe about 6 months. So I will say that, and I will say that I'm also probably the least technologically adept of all the people on this panel. But I actually don't think that's, from the perspective of what I think we're talking about, I don't think it's a novel concern. I think it's a new mechanism by which the nature of the political sort of functions, and its tendency to be a space of opinion and untruth and interest and prejudice rather than sort of truth. I mean, this is I have no patience for sort of concerns that we're in an age in which truth is being destroyed. We have the death of truth, and truth is, we're in a post-fact age, a post-truth age, and I want somebody to point out to me when truth was the dominant currency in politics, and when was the era in which people were like really digging on facts, and I mean that when were we, if our untruths are being proliferated through our phones, that's fine. They used to be proliferated at our kitchen tables and in our neighborhood chats, and sort of, and it doesn't. I mean, yeah, listen, don't get me wrong, it's a nightmare, but I think it's always been a nightmare. So, I think that democratic politics is always a little bit terrible, and it just finds different ways to be terrible, and then wonderful in different new ways, and then, it's okay, because we'll all be dead in the end.
I just wanted to say, sir, that you asked a good question. I tend to be more apocalyptic about this. I believe that the internet has, I agree that American political discourse has rarely been elevated. I think that's what you're saying. And if you're saying that it's a threat, I agree with you. Have you heard of the phenomenon of deep fakes? Have you heard of deep fakes? Deep fakes is this new technology where you could, technology is developed where my image can be imposed on you. You're speaking, but it's be my gestures and my face, and even my voice. And it's the technology is advancing to the point that you can't tell what's real and what's fake anymore. There was an article, I think, on Sunday's New York Times that some philosophy professor from Paris, who I guess by Hofstadter's standards was automatically disqualified as someone we should listen to, but he was arguing that the internet has basically killed satire. That there's so many outlandish things posted on the internet that you can't even tell what's funny and what's true anymore. So that destroys the whole idea, the whole purpose of political discourse and being able to jab people has now been turned upside down because you can't tell what's a lie and what's true anymore. So, I'm sorry?
With a virtual framework, you have, an artificial intelligence that's moving ideas. Is that still a true statement that you're receiving?
I agree, and I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, unfortunately.
I'm aware that we're running out of time when I actually have run out of time. So with Professor McCarty's thought that things have always been a nightmare, rolling around my head, I would like to thank the three of you so very much for being with us today.